So this is actually going to be my first time painting with a palette knife. Although I made a tiny bit of progress with trying to be looser in my previous painting, I thought I'd really push myself and try doing a painting with just a palette knife. Well, mostly a palette knife. First, as you can see though, I did a quick underpainting in yellow ochre just to get something on the canvas to make it easier to draw the castle in later. And I'm lifting some paint off here and there to indicate the lighter areas. And I'm using yellow ochre because I like how it makes the sky look, especially with very sunny scenes like this one. So after the underpainting, I checked my proportions in general and started drawing in the castle. Now, the drawing wasn't too off, but it was too high on the page, and that was because of how I printed the reference pictures, which I talked about in my previous video, and also because I decided to work on a bigger paper, so having to enlarge the image by eye multiplied the problem. So later, as I got into the painting, I tried to lower the castle on the page, but between that and trying to get straight lines with the palette knife, it did end up a bit wonky and squished. But overall, the problems aren't too noticeable unless you're looking for it or comparing the painting to the original picture. Now, at this point is where I really decided to give the palette knife a real go. I was still thinking of maybe trying out that flat brush I was just using because it's new, but from here on, I only use the palette knife or my fingers. I started with the easiest part, which was the sky, and the first thing I noticed was that it's quite easy to accidentally scrape the paint off. The angle of the knife is very important, otherwise it kind of likes to catch the paint if it's just the slightest bit off. Maybe it was just me and the way I was initially holding, but about halfway through the sky I eventually got used to it and it didn't happen again. And now I put some finishing touches on the clouds. I mixed in some white with a lot of medium to give them a bit of translucency. So that's always something nice to play with when you're laying down a lot of paint. And at this point things were going okay, and I continued with the palette knife. And I started on the grass because that seemed like the next easiest thing. And I didn't start with the right colors, I started with darker colors. I can't give the grass texture like I could with a brush, so instead I tried to give a texture by building up textured layers of different greens until I reached the right color I want. And I had a bit of a hard time here with the curve on the right. Really, all the right edges were quite hard because because I'm right-handed, I can only see really the left tip of the palette knife. And I couldn't think of a way around this that didn't involve moving the canvas, so I did the best I could trying to get the paint in a small part of the palette knife so I knew where I was dragging it. Later I ended up using my fingers to blend things in a bit. Now, at this point, the canvas paper started to really warp. I have recently bought some actual canvas, but I've yet to make the stretcher bars for it, and I want to use up all my canvas paper first. Anyways, the warping made it a bit hard to draw straight lines, so at the end of my first session, I let the painting dry, and then I sprayed the back with water and left it beneath my printer for at least an hour or so. And I kept doing that after each session, so that helped a bit with that. You can stretch and tape down canvas paper, but it likes to rip, so I don't do that. And of course I flattened it at the end as well. The paper isn't 100% flat now, but if I were to frame it, you wouldn't notice. It's slightly wavy instead of warped. Anyways, here I started working on the actual building, and I was having quite a hard time with this. In fact, I spent the majority of my time on this wall. I was almost about to scrape it at one point, but then something slowly started to click. At first, I approached each section of the building individually because I was having quite a hard time controlling the palette knife. But you'll see as I approached the other side and started to get used to what it could and couldn't do, I started to get looser and looser. I started to lay down larger areas of color and then worked to the details. Also, as I intended, forcing myself to use the palette knife eventually forced me to simplify the detail and worry more about the overall look than the details. So I highly suggest you try this at least once, just as an exercise. And at this point, I also realized that I probably should have maybe skipped adding as much detail as I did in the initial drawing. I mostly ended up covering it and ignoring it anyways. It would have probably been easier just outlining the building, then laying down large flat areas of color, then the shadows, then separating the floors, and starting to add all those details. It might have ended up with more perspective issues because of the lack of a guiding drawing, but it would have looked more together, if that makes sense. In the end, I did tweak some of the overall colors and I smudged some things with my fingers, but it still looks a bit pieced together in some parts, especially because you'll see at some points I also had to add some extra sky in a few places, and that was a bit tricky getting the edge where the building meets the sky to look good. Now, I didn't really enjoy painting with the palette knife overall, but for large areas like the sky, since you have to put a lot of paint down, I did like that it gave me a lot of time to blend. In the future, I might try combining using a palette knife to spread the paint, and then a large brush to blend it to get soft gradients. And one of the things that I didn't like was that once it was dry, it's kind of hard to get smooth blended areas because you're catching on that dry paint. So it's something that I think would be nicer to work with in oils, maybe. Anyways, I'm nearing the end here, and I messed up a bit on the grays in this top area. They looked a bit warmer to me than they were, but I quickly fixed that, and also, you see, I'm trying to work large to small like I mentioned I should have before. Then finally moving on to the smaller details, adding in a touch of burnt umber and burnt sienna in some of the windows to give them that warmth I was seeing, and then also some blue in some of the ones in shadow to help indicate that they're windows and not just part of the wall. And here is the finished painting. Took about 6 hours in total, but almost a week to complete because I had to keep straightening the paper. This one is also for sale, details in the description. If you found the video helpful, please consider subscribing. If you have any questions, leave a comment, and I'd love to know about your experiences with different painting instruments, what you've tried, what you're thinking about trying, which are your favorites. Personally, I'm planning on making myself one of those silicone brushes. I've had my eye on them for quite a while, but they're expensive, so hopefully I'll make that into a tutorial in the future.